Cimoooooooo! What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I'm bringing to you my competitive tier list for the February 2020 format. Now, bit of a disclosure before we go into this isn't like the end-all be-all when it comes to the format. This is purely my subjective opinion of how I've kind of determined the format is shaping up. I've been going deep into the tank, synthesizing all the data from all the regionals this past weekend, as well as the info that we got from the Pro Play Tour a couple weeks back, because we have a lot of big tournaments coming up. We have the Card Market Series event taking place in Paris this weekend at the time of recording. We have the UDS taking place in Tulsa. We have YCS Las Vegas as well as YCS Utrecht on the same weekend, and there's also the UDS in Bogota the weekend after that. So I want to make sure you guys have as much info as possible, that if you are attending any of these events, or maybe even some regionals or anything like that, that you kind of know the direction you should be taking going into this format. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So we're over here on Tier Maker as always. We have our categories, Tier 0, Tier 1, Tier 2, Rogue, and everything else. There's some decks you may see down here that you might be shocked to see here. However, I will be covering also some older decks from last format, as well as the decks that are emerging in this format. So, starting with Altergeist, I actually have Altergeist in the Tier 1 status. Altergeist has been winning numerous regionals. It won the Pro Play Tour event a couple weeks back in a field just absolutely swarming with Spiral, and I think it's actually a pretty solid deck for what it's worth. It's crazy when a trap deck goes second to one of the strongest going first decks in the game and consistently can 2-0 the opponent. I mean, it's crazy, and there's a lot of advantages to playing it. Again, this is like pre-Lightning Storm era still, but even with Lightning Storm kind of just still starting to just proliferate and get around, because yeah, people have to start cracking open the product. Ignition Assault is only a week old at this point. Even so, the back row decks are still able to thrive, and I don't think Lightning Storm is going to be as impactful against the back row decks as people think. It's definitely going to make an impact for sure, but I don't think that takes away from the strengths that Altergeist necessarily has, and for the moment, it's looking to be a solid Tier 1 contender. Next up, we have Infernoid. This is a bit of a weird one. I'm putting this in the everything else category. As you guys know, Infernoid has like this weird going second variant that's kind of been popularized by Clifton Land a few months back, and that's kind of the way people have been playing the deck, right? And the thing is, it's fine. I mean, people are kind of using it as this possible anti-meta to Spiral, because there's like some interesting interactions that it has against that particular matchup. I just don't know how it holds up against like all the other decks, because yes, you could be like playing for the 20% being Spiral, but then you still have to worry about the other 80% of the field, which that may not be very favorable to you. So I think it's interesting. It's something to note that like you might possibly run into Infernoid, but I wouldn't worry about it, but just be mindful that it is lurking around. Same thing goes for Madolche. Madolche actually got a regional top this past weekend, interestingly enough. One thing I will note is that you're going to see a lot of going second decks on here. Infernoid's going second, Madolche's going second. Going second decks have actually a lot of opportunity to thrive at this moment, because Spiral is like enemy number one. I guess I should just go ahead and talk about that for a moment since I just mentioned it. Spiral we're putting up here. We're putting this in the front of the Tier 1 category, simply due to the fact it is the best deck. It's the most represented deck at the moment, and unless something big changes or people figure out something, it's going to be the just leading carrier of the format, because it is just so powerful. It's so potent. Going first or second, the deck is very explosive, and it just goes to show that, I mean, we've seen the deck perform already. We know what it's capable of, and that was just in the early stages of the format. Keep in mind, there are still 3 different variants. There's like the pure variant, which is pretty streamlined. Obviously, you're still playing Magician Souls in all these variants. There's like the scrap variant, which I think people are scrapping, no pun intended, simply due to the fact that you are playing more bricks in a Spiral deck, and the inherent inconsistencies that the deck already has kind of make it a bit difficult. And then there's also the Extravagance build as well. So the thing is, I think when it comes to Spiral, I think people are starting to kind of divide themselves into the 2 camps of the pure as well as the Extravagance list. The jury's still out on which one is still the best, but both are still very explosive, and you need to be prepared. This deck is enemy number 1. And all these other decks are kind of circulating around, can they beat Spiral? And that's really what it comes down to. Next up is, I couldn't remember the deck for a second because I'm like, Alistair. It's Mechadyne Invoke. So Mechadyne Invoke I'm actually putting in the Rogue category. If you guys remember way back in the initial stages of Spiral format in 2017, if you were playing back then, Invoked was a very interesting deck because it is able to play just an absolute shit ton of hand traps, and because of that, you have this one card engine in Alistair that if you're able to like slow down the opponent with all of your defensive cards, then you could set up Alistair, potentially get like Mecha Bus, start to take control of the game. And yeah, even though it's a bit of a slower deck in that regard, having this just very defensive hand trap oriented deck is something that works. And there's some other decks that also do something very similar. But interestingly enough, this has one of the highest win rates of decks on Dueling Book. And yes, I know we're talking about Dueling Book here, but again, it's like one of the most played decks and actually has a higher win rate than like Spiral at the moment and all these other decks, which is very peculiar to me. It's also topped several regionals as of late, so I don't think this is something you should underestimate. This is, again, another going second deck, and it's something that you should definitely be mindful of. Next up is Hero. Hero's an interesting one. I'm kind of like tempted to put it like in Rogue, like slash tier 2, I suppose. Like you could make the argument for either one. I think because of representation, I'm gonna go ahead and put it into tier 2. It is a bit of a glass cannon of a deck, but as soon as you can like make it past that turn 1, or even going second, the deck is actually pretty decent as well. It kind of just turns the rest of your deck on. You have a lot of just very powerful cards. I think one of the things when it comes to Hero that I'm not exactly fond of, and I think actually, you know, now that I think about it, I might actually dump this down back into Rogue. When it comes to Hero, I think one of my biggest issues is it kind of loses to a lot of the same cards that Spiral already does, and people are already playing those same cards anyway, so at that point, it's just like a significantly weaker deck. However, you are still going to be seeing it just simply due to the popularity of the archetype, and this is like probably like one of the best variants you've had the opportunity to play, since it's like a metagame that's still undefined relatively, and overall, you are going to see it, but you don't have to worry about it too much. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it tops. It's still a very decent deck for what it's worth. Guru Control I'm putting up in tier 2. This is a bit of an odd one because it's kind of like another variant of like Altergeist, but just in a different way. Like it plays a lot of the same cards. You play your evenly matches, your strikes, your warnings, but then like the play style is different. It has like a little bit more consistency because it's easier to get to your win condition effectively in Guru, but then it has a little bit more of a difficult time closing out games. I think Altergeist actually has a much higher like damage ceiling than a deck like Guru, so it's weird. I mean, it's like you could argue that like these decks are kind of very similar, but they're in different tiers, but I definitely think people are writing Guru off at the moment. I still think the deck is very, very solid for all the same reasons Geist is. It has some different strengths that Geist does and also shares a lot of the same weaknesses, but this deck is still very good. Being able to Book of Moon cards in like a link-oriented format seems pretty good, and again, you have all the floodgates to kind of just bolster all your defensive options as well, so I think Guru's perfectly fine. Okay, so you guys are going to be like, why the hell is True Draco on here? True Draco actually won a regional, as a matter of fact. Yeah, it won a regional with 1 diagram and 1 demise. I think that is absolutely insane. Again, bear in mind, you're probably not going to see a lot of this deck, but I just wanted to mention that it won a regional. Again, that is like, take that with a grain of salt or for what it's worth, but the fact that it won a regional, you can't say that this deck isn't at least doing something if it won a regional. That's a little bit crazy. Next up is Endymion. This is kind of funny. I'm actually putting Endymion and kind of the Pendulum decks in the everything else category. These decks have just completely fallen off the face of the earth ever since the Pro Play Tour, and they just aren't really seen anywhere. Yeah, there's still going to be some people experimenting with them and trying them, but at the current moment, even with the strength that these decks have, they're just not seeing the representation. And so you have to remember, when it comes to the tier list, this isn't just based solely off of the power level of the decks, but it's also based off of their representation. So when you're reading this, you should expect to see the tier 1 decks the most, the tier 2 decks followed after that, and then the rogue decks, and then everything else like has like a very small percentage of showing up, but it's something people are messing around with. That's kind of where I put Endymion right now. Even as strong as the deck may be, it just doesn't have the numbers. So that's why I'm putting this in the everything else category. Orcas is a bit weird. I'm putting it in tier 2. It's still a deck that a lot of people are playing, even with the banning of Orcas Harp Horror, but it definitely has descended from its former tier 1 status for sure. The deck definitely has a little bit more of a difficult time actually doing its main combo, but you still have the scrap cards to help facilitate a lot of the plays. The dangers also help with that as well. You also got a ton of draw power. Allure of Darkness, you've got Orchestrated Return. There's a lot of good advantages still to playing the deck, and I still think it's a very formidable tier 2 deck at the moment. It does have the numbers. It's been still topping regionals, and it's been doing a decent bit just overall, and so that's why I'm inclined to keep it at tier 2. I'm not sure if it's going to keep falling, but I think after like the UDSs and the YCSs, we'll know for sure. Grand Maggio I'm putting in Rogue. Grand Maggio, apart from Nessie getting hit to 1, I believe, I don't think that deck incurred any other hits on the most recent ban list. And again, like I said, it's another going second deck. Don't be surprised if you see this deck at a YCS or any big tier event, because this deck is absolutely explosive and it's going to just completely steal wins out of nowhere like it's done for the past several months. So that's there. Salomon Great is in the tier 1 status in my opinion. This deck has been having lots of heavy representation as of late. People are just figuring out that even though Mirage Stallion is banned, the deck is still good. It's still playable. You just have to, it's just so recursive, right? That's one of the strengths of this deck, is that even after turn 1, as long as you can just get a fairly decent setup with like Sunlight Wolf, recur maybe 1 or 2 of your traps, and kind of have that, even if your board gets wiped, you have all your resources, right? You still have your Jack Jaguar, your Spinny, your Falco, your Gazelle. Like, you have everything again for next turn to keep putting on the pressure, and I think that's why a lot of people are gravitating towards this deck. It's also another deck similar in line to this Mechadyne Invoke deck that can play a ton of hand traps. When you look at these Salomon Great lists, they're playing in the neighborhood of like 9 to 12 hand traps, because they can play that because a lot of their combos are easily facilitated through the rest of their engine, that it really isn't a huge loss to play all of those hand traps. So again, for those reasons, that's why I've got tier 1 Salomon Great. And I think we're going to continue to see that deck dominate as we move further into the format. Sky Striker's going in the everything else category. I know some of you guys might be thinking, oh, is there like some crazy Sky Striker deck? No, that deck's like hasn't been anywhere. Some of the like top players who played Striker were trying to make it work. To be fair, it could still work. I mean, the decks they were playing weren't like completely just out of the question, but again, in terms of representation, the deck is nowhere to be found. But bear in mind, some of the better players, former Striker players, are still kind of messing around with it, so who knows, you could come across it at some point. Thunder's also going to the everything else category. Titan Control just isn't doing it, and there's still the possibility to play like Danger Thunder as well, but again, the numbers aren't there. There's just so many other decks at the moment that are just so much better, and Titan just isn't enough. Losing Colossus really hurt the deck significantly. We got Danger Lunalight. I'm actually putting this in tier 2. This is a very cool deck. Lunalight, again, we've had forever. We had Lunalight Orcas last format, but Danger Lunalight still able to just turbo out rank 4 Xyz monsters. What's interesting about it is now the inclusion of the Time Thieves, which are a little bit bricky at times, but add a different dimension to the deck because you're able to go into cards like Redoer as well as Perpetua, the new card from Ignition Assault, and make some absolutely crazy boards. This deck is a bit fragile because like its consistency can sometimes be its demise, but it has a very high ceiling, and so it is a bit of a feast or famine style of deck, but definitely learn the intricacies of this deck because there are some good pilots messing around with this, and I wouldn't be surprised if this takes multiple tops at high tier events. And then last but not least, I've got Dinosaur. I'm going to put Dinosaur probably towards like the top end of Rogue. This is another deck that's been performing quite well. Another going second deck, as I said, so that's what, like 5 now that I've mentioned. It's very, very explosive. Ultimate Conductor Tyranno is an absolute beast of a card, and just the Dinos have just always been good at going second, not to mention going first. You've got options in if you're playing the True Kings, like playing True King of All Calamities. Just a very solid deck for what it's worth, but I think this is what the format is going to be shaping up to be for the next month or so, unless we have some huge tectonic shift in the format. This is probably what you can expect, but then again, I could be wrong. We'll just have to see what happens. So guys, that's going to go ahead and wrap up this competitive tier list and sort of analysis. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.